And then moving on to the giant ragweed seed production, what we found is that on average giant ragweed produces about 1,600 seeds per plant. Those seeds are very large, so they do not tend to move very far in terms of wind movement, that type of thing. Giant ragweed produces viable seed at the beginning of September, so it pollinates at the beginning of August. That seed then begins to develop and really doesn't develop any viability until around September. So, and then once September rolls around, then we do start to see seed shattering off of those giant ragweed plants. The rate of that seed shattering does vary quite a bit depending on the year. So between 2012, that seed fell off the plants very slowly, whereas in 2013 it fell off very rapidly. So in terms of a typical soybean harvest date in Minnesota is usually around October 16th on average. So at that point in time, in 2012, for instance, only about 10% of that seed had fallen off the plant at that time, whereas in 2013, about half of that seed would have been off of those plants. So that really tells us that depending on the year, a large proportion of that seed is actually going through your combine, especially in soybean with a soybean platform. That essentially funnels that seed into the combine and will spread that seed if it passes through the combine or end up in the grain, depending on how that combine is set and the weight of that seed. So some strategies you might want to think about employing. You might want to think about driving around any smaller patches of weeds, preventing those weeds from being spread across the entire field. Just allowing those seeds to even drop their seeds straight down so that your problem is only confined to a small, maybe a 3 or 4 foot square area rather than being spread across 30 or 40 feet if it were to be run through your combine. The other thing to keep in mind is that when we do have the development of these resistant populations, that weed seed can get hung up inside that combine, and then when you're moving to different fields, you could be spreading that resistant giant ragweed seed over long distances and making the problem worse elsewhere as well. However, in agricultural settings, it is oftentimes found in the fence row areas of the fields. So typically in these fence row areas, if those weeds aren't controlled, they grow and produce some seed, and that seed doesn't move very far into the field. However, if that seed ends up going through your combine, that seed does end up being spread across that field and then can become an increasingly large problem in the entire field. Rather than just around the edges or in those fence row areas. In terms of actually managing your fence rows, you could think about maybe going out there throughout the summer. You could, even if you get delayed into August, that seed hasn't been produced, so you could think about targeting these fence rows with some sort of herbicide application, or even mowing those fence lines up until September when that giant ragweed seed actually is developing viability. So as long as you can wipe those populations out before that viable seed has been developed, you could use that as a control strategy in these site-specific areas.